First way.
Hey, Jess, am I good to go? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program with Dwight Chapin, author of The President's Man. I'm Kathy McCormick. I'm board president here at Perrot Library. I want to thank the members of the Perrot Memorial Library Association who make programs like this possible. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. Details can be found on our website, perrotmemoriallibrary.org, or we have envelopes in the back with details on how to become a member. I also want to thank Jess Reed of Greenwich Point Marketing, who is helping us with tonight's Zoom, and she also helps us keep connected to the community in all sorts of ways. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our partner, Athena Books in Old Greenwich. Athena Books is joining us tonight. They're selling books in the back, so please, if you'd like a book signed by Dwight, you can stay after and pick up a book. And if you're joining us on Zoom and you have a question, you can put your question in the chat and feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly to Dwight at the end. Now it's my honor to introduce our guest. Dwight Chapin served as personal aide and then deputy assistant to President Richard Nixon with the responsibility for the planning and execution of the president's schedule and appearances. He served as acting chief of protocol for the president's 1972 historic trip to China. After his time in the White House, Chapin was publisher of Success magazine and then managing director for Asia for Hill and Knowlton Public Relations. For the last 25 years, he has managed his own consulting firm focused on communications and strategic planning. Thank you, Dwight, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Can everybody hear me? Okay, terrific. It's wonderful being here. I want to say at the outset that doing this in my hometown is spectacular, and knowing we have around 40 people, evidently, according to what I'm being told, that are participating by Zoom. So that's terrific. And we will have questions from those people as well as from you. I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then we'll switch it over. I want to point out my wife, Terry Goodson, who's here in the front row, the greatest support part of my that I could possibly have, and it's great that she is here. My stepdaughter, Taylor Pavelski, has just arrived, and she is back there with a very important person, and that is my grandson, John Pavelski, who just graduated from the 8th grade, is moving up, but his claim to fame in my mind is he finished my book. He read the whole thing. Not only that, he's asked me questions, so he obviously understands a lot about it. This was a labor of love. It took 2.5 years. It happened to come about at the time of COVID, so it made for a rather convenient time to isolate right here in Riverside, Connecticut, and to apply pen to paper and to come up with this story, which is basically the story of my relationship with President Nixon. And I want to tell you a few Nixon stories to kind of get us rolling, and then we'll have whatever questions you might have. I thought that it might be interesting to mention, a lot of people really don't know, that Nixon became vice president of the United States when he was 39 years old. That's how young he was when General Eisenhower picked him to be his running mate in 1952. Nixon became president when he was 55. So he did not make it to the Oval Office for many years, but the important part is that he was in the government at such a young age. He had been a congressman, vice president, a senator before becoming vice president. And then he had the wilderness years, which was the period from 1960 till he won in 1968. They call that the wilderness years. He practiced law in New York City. and he remained active in politics through that whole time. All that's important to know because when Richard Nixon was elected president, one of the first things he had to do was to pick his cabinet. And I'm mentioning this because of the environment today and to kind of give you a hinge as to what it was like back then. When Nixon got elected president, he started interviewing people to become members of his cabinet. And they would come in and meet with him and they would leave. And contrary to the way that it's done today, he would not go out and announce a cabinet officer he had just picked. He kept that to himself until he had interviewed every one of the potential cabinet members and made his decisions. And then in December of 1968, keep in mind, he's not going to be inaugurated until January of 1967. So, I mean, it's 1969. So he is it's December, and he requests from the networks the opportunity to go on national television. And so it was like mid-December at the Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C., and I was there that evening, and he had all of the cabinet members that were going to go forward for confirmation that he had picked, seated kind of in a semicircle, and their wives were all seated with him. And then he proceeded to go around and stand with each one of them and explain to the nation why he had picked every single one of those people and what he expected them to do for our country. It was a unique event. It was only done once by him, and it's never been done again. And that evening, 30% of the country, 100 million people, watched that happen. Keep in mind, we didn't have cable. The media wasn't fractured like it is today. So NBC, CBS, ABC all carried it live, and the public got to see and meet the people that were going to be responsible for their government. One of the things that's interesting about this story, in my opinion, is the next morning, he had basically his first cabinet meeting. Even though the people had not been confirmed, he met with them there at the Shoreham. And he said to them at the outset, he said, "Gentlemen and ladies, I apologize. There were no ladies in this group. It was a different era than we would be confronting now. But he said, gentlemen, I want to tell you something. You're going to be confirmed and you're going to move into these departments, housing and education, the Department of State, the Department of Transportation, you name it, you're going to be leading it." And then he said, you're going to have anywhere from 90 to 120 days before the bureaucracy engulfs you and you can't make any more decisions. And my point on this is that the bureaucracy part of what we now know as the deep state was something that Nixon was very aware of through his vice president years and so forth. He knew that his government needed to get in there, take control, and make changes. And I am not trying to disparage Donald Trump, but that was one of the things that distinguishes what Nixon knew about how he was going to have to lead. And then when Donald Trump went in, it took him months to figure out how he was going to do this and so forth. So Nixon had a distinct advantage. And I've always thought that was kind of a line of demarcation, because our cabinet officers went in there and they started rolling, and we got a tremendous amount done in the first few months of the Nixon administration. So that's one story. Another story I want to tell you is about some work I was doing as we were getting ready to promote the president's man. And I had had the incredible experience of going with Dr. Kissinger for the opening of China. In fact, I was named one of the 10 outstanding young men in the country for the work that I did with Dr. Kissinger and the president on that journey. The president had determined that this was back when he was in his wilderness years, that Asia was going to have to, he wrote a foreign affairs article on Asia after Vietnam. So here he is, back in the wilderness years. He hasn't even announced that he's running for president, but he's writing a foreign affairs article on Asia after Vietnam. So he had a plan. He knew what he wanted to do. On the morning that we went and left for Beijing, so this would have been February of 1972, the president walked out of the diplomatic entrance of the White House, which goes out onto the South grounds. And you've seen it many times on television. You walk out from the South portico and the helicopter is there. And it's the famous picture that you always see of any of the presidents walking to that helicopter and taking off. When the Nixons walked out of the diplomatic receiving room, the president walked up to a microphone and he said, "I would like to thank Senator Mike Mansfield, the Democratic leader of the Senate, for being here this morning, and Wilbur Mills, the Speaker of the House. And I would like to thank all of the other bipartisan members of Congress that are here this morning." And they were all there, and they were all supporting our president. This wasn't a Republican issue. This wasn't a Democratic issue. They were there because that's what that group of men did. And it's important because early on in the administration, like the first week, I had received a memorandum. And the president said, "I want to meet with the bipartisan leaders of Congress every week. And if they're not available on Tuesday, set it up for Thursday." And every single week, those bipartisan leaders would traipse from up on the hill down to the White House, and they would either go into the Oval Office or into the cabinet room, and they would sit with the president of the United States and they would discuss policy. Now, keep in mind, Nixon had a divided government. He was a Republican. We had a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate. They had to figure out how to get along. They had to figure out what they were going to do. And I make the point that in today's world, if the bipartisan leaders come up to meet with the president, it's like national news. I mean, there is no cooperation between all of these people. And one of the things that's in my book and that I try to really highlight are the accomplishments of this man. And those accomplishments have to be shared with those Democratic members of Congress. And Nixon would have no problem sharing that with those men. They passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the OSHA Act, the 18-year-old vote, OSHA, the Environmental Protection Agency, low-income assistance housing, I said all volunteer army, the 18-year-old vote. I mean, I can't recall them all here right now, but they got all that done in the first term. So the only way that would have been accomplished were these people working together. Quite a contrast to the environment that we see now. Lastly, or it may not be lastly, it depends on how much I decide to ramble on here, but I want to tell you a story about the president that's really, I think, quite revealing. And this is about the man himself. You know, we have a introvert. His capacity is intellectual stuff. I mean, he's this outgoing celebrity style presidency that we're so used to now was not what this man was all about. He was a workaholic. He loved policy. He loved policy wonk type stuff. He loved sitting in his office for hours debating various policy options and looking at briefing books. But one of the things about him was his personality. And we hear and we see on television, particularly as we're reviewing Watergate, this characterization of this man, which very honestly is very contrary to the man that I knew. Now, I was very, very lucky. I had an experience a few minutes ago. I was kind of waiting for you all to arrive and get these people online and so forth. And I ventured in here to the children's library and kind of was sitting by myself. And what flashed in my mind was the number of times that I sat alone in a holding room with Richard Nixon as he was getting ready to do something of magnitude. We would be in the holding room before he went out onto the stage to accept the Republican nomination. We would be in the holding room before he went off to meet with Chairman Mao in China or in Moscow. I would be with him on the airplane when we circled the Capitol and he's landing to go give his speech. So I have this image, and one of the images I have of him is briefcase on his lap, his hands basically covered with ink. And the thought that popped in my head when I was having kind of this recall was his hands covered with ink, and he always had a Parker pen because the Parker pen people from Ohio were great supporters, and they kept sending him these fountain pens. And Mrs. Nixon would get mad and say, "Why are you using these fountain pens? They're leaking all over everything." But in any case, that's what he used. Anyway, here's the story that I love. We were going into Italy. And when you go to Italy, you visit the government of Italy, and then you also visit the Vatican. The trips have to be separated. You can't go the same day. It's a protocol thing. So, because the Vatican is a state, and they don't want to be a subcategory state, they want to be of equal stature to Italy itself. So, on this particular situation, we were flying into Italy, and Vern Coffey, who was the president's military aide, an African-American guy that was spectacular. Nixon calls Vern in and said, "Vern, I want you to go through the plane, Air Force One, and find out who all is Catholic on the Air Force One staff." Okay, Vern says. So he goes through the plane and he finds out who all is Catholic. A day and a half later, we are getting ready to go to the Vatican. And we go, the president says to Vern, please send a car out to where the Air Force One was out at the air base, and bring in the people that are practicing Catholics. And so when we met at the Vatican, There was the official party of which I happened to be part, and there were the group that had come in from Air Force One. So we go into this chamber, and it was one of the, I must admit, I'm not Catholic, like some people I know here, but to have the President of the United States introduce you to the Holy Father is quite an experience. I mean, it was really, well, let me tell you, I called my grandparents and, I said, you're not going to believe what happened today. But what was really nice was he finished with the staff, and then he brought the Air Force One people over. And I'll never forget, there was this Filipino steward working on the plane, doing coffee and the meals and so forth. And he's standing there, and the President of the United States introduces him to the Pope. And the tears are streaming down this man's face. And I've always thought, what a gift Richard Nixon gave that man. I am sure wherever he is today, he's telling that story about how President Nixon graced his life by having him be able to meet the Holy Father. And Nixon, I would add, is so misunderstood. Our primary problem, you all know, and it's a four-letter word: tapes. Richard Nixon put in that taping machine. Now, there's two advantages to it, or one distinct advantage, and that is we happen to have the most documented presidency in the history of our republic. To date, only 5% of the tapes have been transcribed. 95% of the tapes are still left to be looked at. And God only knows what they're going to say, but many of us believe that there'll be exploratory material on there that will be of help to President Nixon as the public learns over the years ahead how he handled certain issues and how he approached things. So we're very hopeful that the tapes themselves end up really being proven to be an asset. I will say that, and in large part thanks to Terry here, in the back of this book, we have some tapes that Terry translated with the help of a professional person who is probably the most knowledgeable person on the tapes. He's written 2 books. His name is Luke Nichter. He is a historian. And he and Terry made sure that the substance in here is correct. And you can take my book and go to the tape that's mentioned, and you can bring that up on the internet, or pardon me, you can read it in the book, and then you can bring up the audio on the internet so that as you're reading the transcript, you can hear what John Dean is saying in the president's office. And the disparity that exists between what John Dean has said officially and what is on the tapes and what he admits to the president. Because for 9 months, in 1972, in June, as many of you know, the anniversary being last Friday, 50 years ago, last Friday, is when all of this happened, the break-in. And Nixon never knew the truth of all that until March 13th of 1973. For 9 months, he was never told the truth of what happened. It's complicated, and one of the things that is so difficult for some of us that are immersed in this is that we know we're finding out more every year about what happened, but our knowledge of what happened has to be positioned against the traditional narrative that people have heard for 50 years. So it's a little like pushing an avalanche back up the mountain. But we are determined to do this. We have a tremendous number of good, solid young historians that are starting to go back and to look at these tapes. And I would make one other point on the tape. When the prosecution was underway, the prosecutors and the way that the legal process was working was what the aha factor. They would go in and they'd find a clip of videotape that proved a point they wanted to make. So that tape would be released to the public or used in a trial, and for the most part was devastating. What we are now getting ready to do is to go back and to look at these tapes for like what was said on that tape for the 3 or 4 minutes leading into the statement and out of the statement, because we're finding that the interpretation of the clip that was used for prosecution is not necessarily compatible with the truth of what happened. Now, will that resolve everything, and will that clear Richard Nixon? Absolutely not. The important thing to have in your mind as you're thinking about this, or God willing, reading my book, is that Richard Nixon went on national television with David Frost, and he apologized to the nation. And in particular, he apologized to the young people of this country. He felt that one of the greatest disservices that he had brought about to our country was to bring about a sense of cynicism or low regard for our institutions. And that really bothered his conscience. And he apologized to the nation for that. So the issue is not, was Richard Nixon guilty, and did Richard Nixon apologize? He did do that. The issue is, how bad was he? What kind of man was he? Was he someone that approached this with a sense of evilness, and that he was trying to rape the country of our democracy? Or was he truly a public servant? He was in office for 50 years. He worked for this nation. He believed in it. He was a patriot. He was a veteran. And he believed in what the country was all about. Many people think that his resignation at the end was because it was a patriotic act, that he didn't want to put the nation through a resignation. There may be some truth to that. There's also truth to the fact that he himself was probably very apprehensive about what was going to happen, and so he was protecting himself. The only other piece of information that adds to that is in 1960, when Jack Kennedy beat him, there were serious questions about the votes in Illinois and the votes in Texas, both states being viewed, particularly by Mrs. Nixon, as a fraudulent election. Mrs. Nixon wanted him to go in and to question those elections, and the president said, no, I won't do that. And so We know his conscience was at work in this, just exactly how it all sorts itself out. Historians are going to have to tell us over a period of time. One other quick story, and then we'll go to questions. I have been doing some work on television productions and Netflix series and some rather special projects that hopefully will mature. But in that research, I found out a couple of things that are very interesting. Richard Nixon's congressional office was next door to Jack Kennedy's. They were great friends. The only person outside of the Kennedy staff invited to Congressman Kennedy's birthday party was his pal, Richard Nixon. And the two of them later, when they became senators, they were both senators, they liked to go out and debate together. So they got on the train and they go out to Pennsylvania. They had a sleeping car. They could both have a sleeping car. But going out, they sat and they kibitzed with one another and telling stories and figuring things out and talking about policy. And coming home late at night after the debate, they never used the sleeping cars. They stayed up all night talking to one another. So it was a different era when all these politicians were talking to one another. So I've got several stories like that in my book. My book is riddled with stories that are true and are experiences that I had. I have a blurb on this book by Henry Kissinger. He said, Dwight, I'll be happy to write you a blurb, but I've got to read the whole book first. And he read the whole book. Karl Rove and then the Democratic historian Douglas Brinkley said that this book was one that we've been waiting for 50 years. That gets into my a side point, if you will. Most books like this are written 10 minutes after the person leaves the White House. Okay, I waited 50 years, and I'm glad I waited 50 years. Those of you that are more on the senior citizen side of things here know that God gives us a little bit more wisdom as we get older, and we look at things a little bit different. And I think I was able to really put a lot of stuff into context, particularly the relationships with several people like my mentor, Bob Haldeman, who was chief of staff, John Ehrlichman, who was the director of the Domestic Council, Dr. Kissinger, Henry, I call him Henry in here. One of the editors said, can you really call him Henry? And I said, well, I've always called him Henry. So the relationship with Henry was incredibly special, as was the relationship with everyone I worked with at the White House. And let me say that among all the people that worked at the White House, whether they ended up being incarcerated or whether they were lucky enough to avoid all that, I worked to be friends with all of them. We were on a journey that was incredibly special. We were privileged beyond anything I could relate to you. And as the Greenwich Times said today, it was a comment I made to the reporter yesterday. This was fantastic. The only thing I wish was that it didn't have a price tag called Watergate. If anybody has a question, or all of you there out in outer space, I'm talking, if you have a question, yes, ma'am.
Well, I love your presentation. You and I are probably about the same age. So I'm a child of Watergate.
39.
Of Watergate, yes. But I was in college at the same time as David Eisenhower, Nixon's son-in-law, Julie, and Tricia. What roles have they played if any, in these 50 years? I know David wrote a book. In trying to get to the truth, the way that you have with your book. And
Right.
you talk with them in doing your book.
Well, I wrote both girls before I started, and I pledged to both girls to be honest and to tell the story the way I knew it. I didn't commit past that. You were talking about two young ladies, and then David Eisenhower and Ed Cox, who married Tricia. The family side of this tragedy is immense. The toll that took. I was asked last Friday, I got to speak at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. It was really quite an experience. And I said there that the question is, how do you feel? I mean, Nixon didn't have to go to prison. Nixon didn't have, and my answer is that he went through a hell a lot worse than mine. This man was president of the United States. He was a proud man, and he had to resign that office, and it was brutal. The people you mentioned, the family members, were on him on that journey to hell.
Mr. Chapin, I wonder if you could comment on the final years of the war in Vietnam. The history that I have read would have it that President Johnson was in negotiations through the South Vietnamese to bring an end to the war, but that the Nixon campaign contacted the South and suggested to them that it would be better for them not to negotiate as President Johnson's team wished, rather to hold out for the better terms that would be available in the Nixon administration. That the consequence of this was that indeed that the South Vietnamese prevented a successful end of the negotiations while Johnson was president. And so that the war then was prolonged for 3 or 4 more additional years. Could you comment on that?
I will. I know. I welcome the question. This is one of the key questions historically. And it is, did Richard Nixon tell Anna Chennault, who Anna Chennault was a go-between with President Tu of South Vietnam, and did Nixon tell her that if they waited, they would get a better deal with him than they would with Lyndon Johnson? This is a huge dispute. So let me give you the bottom line that I understand. We were renovating the Nixon Library. We hired, the National Archives hired 4 independent researchers. We gave all this material to those 4 independent researchers. There was material from the Nixon Library, from the LBJ Library. There are 2 sides to this story. And the question is, Johnson, who gets furious and calls Everett Dirksen, the leader of the Republicans, and says Nixon's a traitor. And then there's the Nixon side of it, where he calls Johnson and says, that's not true. I did not do that. And we have phone calls. We have documents. We have all of the material, except for one thing. We don't know what the truth is. And so what we did at the library is we set it up. Here's one point of view. Here's the other point of view. You as a citizen can read both sides and come to your own conclusion. It's not a perfect solution because in America, we want to know, was it him or was it him? It doesn't fall that way. I've spent time last week with Jim Jones. Jim Jones was LBJ's chief of staff, and he was my liaison during the transition. He came to the Library of Congress event. We're very good friends. He's a Democrat, but he had nominated me to be one of the 10 outstanding young men in the country as a result of my China work. He says that he was with Johnson when Johnson discovered all this. But that's nice, but it doesn't prove anything. The FBI has a role in this. J. Edgar Hoover is involved in this. The CIA is involved in this. And the deeper you get into it, the more controversial it is, and the less is the potential of finding the accurate answer. So I apologize to you. I can't give you an accurate answer. The one thing that I do know for sure, Ken Hughes has written a book on Vietnam, and it is a very left-wing viewpoint. The insinuation, which is mind-boggling to me, and I hate it, is that Nixon and Kissinger worked in a way to prolong the war in order to win elections. That is the furthest thing from the man that I knew. Richard Nixon was a patriot. If there was a way to end that war, he would have called LBJ, or he would have done something to end it. And I don't for 1 second believe that he let American men die in order to promote his own political opportunity. Yes, ma'am.
I was interested in your comments about how Nixon chose his cabinet and the advice that he gave to them to get their work done within 3 months. And I was wondering where that wisdom came from. Did that come from the fact that he had been a vice president for 8 years and had seen what happened in these cabinet positions, or was that part of what he had gleaned from being in the Senate?
Okay, so the question is, where did the wisdom come to President Nixon to have him say, you've got 60 days, 120 days to get in and get ahead of the bureaucracy before it takes you over? How did he know to do that? Well, I think part A is that he watched Dwight Eisenhower. He had experienced how this bureaucracy works. He knows that Washington is more of a Democratic town than a Republican town. I mean, if you had to slice it up, do you know that in the Biden-Trump election, Trump got 5% of the vote in the District of Columbia? I mean, the District of Columbia is solidly Democratic. So I think that's part of the answer. I want to add to your question by mentioning another factor, which led to a number of things and some complicated things that are in the book. Nixon not only gave this advice to his cabinet, but he said to Dr. Kissinger, Henry, we're going to pull policy decisions into the White House, into the National Security Council, and operate policy from in the White House and not at state and not at the Pentagon. And that had huge consequences. The story is quite long. The story is in the book. But what happened is that the Pentagon starts spying on Dr. Kissinger, rifling through his briefcase, stealing documents, and sending them over to the chiefs of staff. In other words, we had a situation because of that bringing it in. The Pentagon was so upset that they were being kind of kept out of things that they retaliated. And there are theories and lots of evidence that various things about Watergate tie back into that. It's very complex, but I think we cover it pretty well in the book. Yes.
Seems that the prevailing theory amongst White House historians would be that the coverage of the Watergate scandal as a whole marked a change from the press somewhat protecting the president to after that going after the president or looking for scandals against the White House. Is that an idea that you agree with, or did you see signs of that?
Help me just a little louder. I'm sorry. I have a hearing deal.
Did you find that the news coverage and press coverage of the Watergate scandal changed how the press as a whole covered the president and the Oval Office?
Is the Pope Catholic? Yes. Let's get to basics. Richard Nixon was vilified by the press. I mean, we had certain times that it bounced back. There was a new Nixon in 1968. You know, he went to China and popularity went up. But for the most part, the press was very antagonistic to Richard Nixon. There are reasons. When Nixon ran for Congress against Jerry Voorhees, this was his first election, Jerry Voorhees was the most popular person in Congress, and Nixon beat him. That didn't make him friends with a lot of the people in Washington. He ran against Helen Kagan Douglas, a darling of the left, for the Senate, and he beat her. He goes into the White House with General Eisenhower, and General Eisenhower, being General Eisenhower, stays way above the politics, and he assigns all the politics dirty work. By dirty work, I mean, speeches and so forth, to Richard Nixon. And then what happens? Nixon ends up running against Jack Kennedy, the darling of Camelot. So Nixon is always kind of in this secondary position, and the media is prone to the other candidates that Nixon was running against. So it was kind of like we were all in catch-up ball. There's a very famous story, it's in the book, 1962, Nixon runs for governor in California to keep his political life alive. He had lost to Kennedy, so he's going to run against Pat Brown for governor of California. He loses. The next morning, he goes down and he says to the media, many of you know this, he says, "You're not going to have Dick Nixon to kick around. Gentlemen, this is my last press conference." The important thing about that statement is that it probably gives you a psychological understanding of Nixon's state of mind at that point. And that was before he confronted all the stuff he confronted when he became president. So he had a lousy relationship with the press. We worked on it constantly. We tried to cultivate certain reporters. He would give stories. There were many reporters that he would meet with on one-on-one, in the office or on the airplane or whatever, and he really liked them, and they got along. The real problem became when they got en masse at a press conference or something like that. But the press relationship with Nixon was always a tough one. They loved Kennedy, loved him. Way back there in the sweater.
So despite your very generous statement that you think Richard Nixon suffered more than you and others who actually went to prison as a result of Watergate, did you ever have a discussion with him afterwards about that experience? And did he ever reflect his feelings of seeing so many of his colleagues end up in prison as a result of this whole affair?
Thank you for the question. So I got out of Lompoc in April. And I believe it was like June that Susie, my wife, and Kimberly and Tracy. Now, so Kimberly would have been maybe 12 and Tracy 10. And we go to San Clemente to see the former president. Well, our families lived in California, so it was natural that we would go out there. And it was really awkward. I mean, we walked into the office, and I had been around him enough, obviously, I knew he's trying to figure out what to do. What does he do with these kids and so forth. And I mean, he's nice, but it was just awkward. Then all of a sudden, he switched into Nixon mode and said something like, "Girls, can you sit here? There's something I want to say to you." And the girl, these little girls, they sit there and looking up at him, and he says, "I just want to say that your dad really did great things for our nation." And pardon me, but the kids don't remember it. I'll never forget it. It was so powerful to me and meant a great deal. He never apologized to me in person. But in February of 1976, I am in Lompoc prison, and a letter arrives from San Clemente. And it says, "Dear Dwight, Mrs. Nixon and I are getting ready to go to China. And I just wanted to touch base with you because I remember so much of what we did when we went in 1972. And I wish you were going with us. Richard Nixon." So I take comfort in the fact that I was on his mind. I mean, I knew the guy. I mean, this we are not dealing with Bob Barker. You come on down. We're gonna, that uppity type. We're dealing with a different kind of man here. And so to your question, I never took offense that we didn't have a discussion about it. That was very Nixonian. In fact, one of the big problems with Watergate was he didn't like confrontation. So, most business people would say to John Mitchell, the Attorney General that worked for Richard Nixon, "John, I want to see you in my office tomorrow morning. What the hell happened? What's going on here?" Nixon didn't want to know. He was a lawyer. If he knew what John said, then he had certain legal obligations. It's very complicated. Next question. Oh, we have one from somebody in outer space.
Yeah. Stuart says, "Let's talk about the elephant in the room. What is your take on the Trump White House?"
The elephant in the room, the Trump White House. There is no elephant in the room. President Nixon and President Trump share something, and that is that they both got elected president. They're very, very, very different men. I will say this, and I don't get into Donald Trump because I don't want to confuse things and get into this crap that we keep going back and forth on where we're psychoanalyzing all this stuff. But Donald Trump woke us up to China. I don't care what anybody says. He started on that tariffs thing, and it led from one thing to another, and it woke us up. And if there is nothing else that you judge that man by, in my opinion, that was an incredibly important thing a service that he performed for America, and we damn well better figure out how we're going to handle him. Yes, sir.
Very nice speech. I guess that was a perfect segue into my question, which is coincidentally 50 years since Nixon went to China. So in a way, Nixon helped open up the relationships. What do you think he would think, if you can read into his mind,
On China?
on China, where we are now?
Okay.
Perhaps your thoughts.
So here we are, 50 years, China and so forth. 50 years ago, right now, well, actually in February, Nixon went to China. 50 years ago, when he was in China, he said, in 50 years, we're going to be adversaries, and we need to know how to talk to one another. So he had some vision there. He anticipated what was going on. This is the great thing about him, really. I mean, I'm talking about a number of stories and everything here, but it's the strategic thinking that he had, the ability to conceptualize where these nations were going and what would happen. He spent his life as from the time he was vice president right on through even all the wilderness years. Every one of the wilderness years that he was out of office, he traveled the world, and he had a pattern. He not only met with the world leaders when he went to a country, he always met with the opposition. His theory was, you don't know who's going to be in power in this nation in 10 years. I want to know the young people. I want to know what they're thinking. I want to know that, I want to know that. In my book, there's one of my favorite quotes. I always use it when I'm talking to a college audience. We were on our way somewhere in the Midwest. It was just the two of us for several months. Just the two of us flew, and I was always on the aisle side to keep people, autographs and all that kind of stuff. He was by the window. We had just finished eating, and he was kind of in a contemplative mood. And during the course of that conversation, he said, Dwight, one of the most important things in life is to always keep your learning curve vertical. And when he was 84 and he fell over on that deck out in Saddle River and had his stroke, he was editing one of his books. I think it was book number 10 that he had written. He had traveled, he kept current. He advised Reagan, he advised Clinton on Soviet policy. He stayed involved. He had resiliency. What would have killed most men and women probably, what he had gone through, he had the resilience to pop back and to stay involved. And any of you that know the Teddy Roosevelt poem about the man in the arena, we have it in the book. The tired and dusty souls that have been, that have been in the arena, that and the poor timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. And Richard Nixon prided himself that he picked himself up and he always got back in the arena. Yes, way in the back.
Dwight, thanks for writing such a great book. And everybody in the book despises John Dean. How did this guy stay in power? How did he get in such a powerful position, and why wasn't he removed long before?
Yeah, I kind of missed part of the question.
Talking about John Dean, how did John Dean stay in his powerful position for so long when everybody seemed to despise him?
Well, it's funny when you trust somebody, they tend to remain in power, and so it's Sunday night. Watergate happens on Saturday. It's Sunday night. John Ehrlichman picks up the phone and calls Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff in Florida. They have a 2-minute phone call, and then Ehrlichman says, "Well, tomorrow I'm going to have John Dean look into it all." Click. He had no idea. He was putting the wolf in the hen house. The only person that knew everything was John Dean. Well, that's not true. There were two people that knew everything. This is well documented in the book. John Dean and Gordon Strachan. Those two men were the only White House men, White House staffers that knew. And Nixon's first question to Haldeman was, is anybody at the White House involved? Bob had looked into it. He said, no. John Dean didn't tell his superior, Bob Haldeman, anything. Gordon Strachan didn't say anything. If either one of those men had had the courage to say, hey, Bob, you know, there's something that's really tragic and I need to tell you what happened, there would have never been a Watergate. Never. But they didn't have the intestinal fortitude. And how in the world do you teach young people to do that? I don't know. I mean, I think it's through our educational process and so forth. I've thought over and over again, if that had been me, what would I have done? I do not believe I ever lied to Bob Haldeman. I mean, I admired him so much, and he was my boss. And you know, we functioned on truth. We functioned on information. I mean, we're dealing with the presidency of the United States. And so Dean and Gordon Strachan really violated, in my mind, the privilege they have. And I'll say this, that when I sent my book to the general counsel of HarperCollins, and you know, they read every single word, you know, to make sure that legally, and that general counsel called me. He said he was 13 years old when all this happened. He said, Dwight, your book has changed my opinion on some of this. But he said, I have one request. Can you change the word about John Dean? Can you say he unfaithfully served the president of the United States? He was a lawyer. He should have known better, and he unfaithfully served the president of the United States. We have another question from the outside world.
We do. Robert asks, were you surprised by the public reaction to the incursion into Cambodia in April 1970? And how do you think the president handled the situation?
Okay, so the insurgency into Cambodia is a question I've never had, but I know a little bit about it, and I've written about it in the book. What was happening was that the North Vietnamese were slipping back into Cambodia to hide and get into their tunnels so that they wouldn't be attacked. And so the decision was made to go bomb those tunnels. And this, so we were going to go into Cambodia. This was very secret. I mean, I think it's Al Haig that tells me about, but I knew about it, that they were going to do it. And then I was in the Oval Office when the president canceled a meeting because they were right in the middle of it. So what they did is they chased them into Cambodia and did the bombing in Cambodia, which I guess under certain protocols and everything would have been against the law. The only saving grace on it is Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia, the leader of Cambodia, who publicly denied this, had told them to go ahead and do it. But he couldn't, because of his, the diplomacy and his relationship there with North Vietnam, Taiwan, and Thailand and so forth, he had to extricate himself from it. But he had given us permission to go do it.
I'm a visitor here from England, and I found your talk most fascinating. What interested me particularly was the bipartisan work that Nixon did in the early days and continued after he left the presidency.
Today, that doesn't seem to happen at all with the present governments around the world. And in a recent piece of work by Professors Daniel Zivit and Stephen Levitsky from Harvard, called How Do Democracies Die? It's the lack of that ability to be reasonable and to be able to talk across a debate and still remain human beings rather than hating the animals that they're dealing with. And you can see this happening here under Trump. You can see it happening in England with Boris Johnson. You can see it happening across Europe with Orbán in Hungary and numerous other people, Putin, whatever. But the inability to talk and respect who they're talking to. And you've got a hatred, and it's leading to the demise of democracy if we're not careful.
Yes, this is a complicated question for me. It gets into cross communications between countries and cooperation versus hatred and so forth. These are huge issues. I am dealing with a finite period of time here, which was my time with Richard Nixon. I am not a foreign policy expert. I was not a top Nixon advisor. I was a young man who had a very unique seat at watching and a privilege of watching a lot of stuff unfold. I don't begin to know the answers to questions like that Henry Kissinger should be answering, or Winston Lord, or any number of the foreign policy experts, and I apologize for that. All I know is, and I've always thought this was rather significant, that I forget exactly how the saying goes, but the greatest of all things is to be known as a peacemaker. And Nixon wanted that on his tombstone. And when you go out to Yorba Linda, California, and you look at the tombstone, it's there. The thing he wanted to be was a peacemaker. He was a Quaker. He did not believe in war. I tell the story of being called into his office early on in the administration. My door to my office was like where that number 9 is. And his Oval Office desk was about right here. And I came through that door, and he's standing there, and he's got these envelopes, and he says, Dwight, he says, give these to Rose Woods. And there's tears coming down his eyes. And they were letters to the parents of kids that had been killed in Vietnam. This war was very personal to him. He was very involved in it in terms of trying to get a solution to that war. He was a Quaker. He didn't believe in war. And it's hard to understand. He's coming from that base just to begin with, but it was very important. Yes, sir.
So maybe perhaps bringing this last question back to your personal experience. So what was Richard Nixon's impression of George McGovern in 1972?
Well, he couldn't believe they were going to nominate George McGovern in 1972. He felt that the Democratic Party had gone too far to the left, and he was very, I think, pleased about it. He wasn't unhappy about that. But the fun part of that story is that in later years, I'll never forget going to President Nixon's funeral, and seated in the front row, crying, was George McGovern. And they had exchanged letters. They had gotten along quite well obviously after the election. And the same thing with Hubert Humphrey. There was a story that my friend Ken Kachigian told. The two of us appeared on Washington Post Live the other day, and Ken told the story about Hubert Humphrey toward the end of his life having severe cancer. And Ken was in the room when Nixon called Hubert and talked to him, and they had a great talk. I happen to be the only person that was in the room when Hubert Humphrey met with Richard Nixon after the 1968 campaign. Keep in mind, in 1960, Nixon lost to Jack Kennedy, and Nixon flies down to Florida to meet with the winner, Jack Kennedy. So here we are 8 years later, and we're in Florida again, and in comes Hubert Humphrey on the plane. They had a plane, and they had Muskie was on there. That was the vice presidential candidate. Muriel, who was Hubert Humphrey's wife. And so the plane lands, and the president had told me just exactly what the president-elect had told me just exactly what he wanted to have happen. So I escorted the two men upstairs into a room, and the Secret Service were outside both doors. I took them in. There were two kind of hardback chairs and a table with water and so forth. And the president-elect had told me, he said, Dwight, 10 minutes. Do you understand me? 10 minutes. You come in here and break this up in 10 minutes. He said that before Humphrey got there. So sure, doing my duty, 10 minutes went by. I walk in. He waved me off. Another 10 minutes went by. He waved me off again. Here we go. The third time I walk in, and the two men are standing, and they have their arms over each other's shoulders. And Hubert Humphrey is bawling like a baby. And Nixon's kind of patting him on the shoulder and saying, it's going to be all right. I know how hard it is. And Hubert chokes out, Dick, I want to do whatever I can to help you. Humphrey pulls out a handkerchief, gets himself in shape. We go downstairs to the gate. I'm standing right next to the president-elect. Humphrey and Muskie and them have gone up the ramp. They're on the plane. And so the prop starts. Johnson didn't give him a jet. He gave him a prop plane. That's how Johnson was treating Humphrey. In any case, the plane starts taxiing around, and President-elect Nixon looks at me and he said, Dwight, that's so hard. Keep in mind the Kennedy thing, that is so hard. He said, but I didn't cry. It was a very funny moment, actually. We've got time, I think, for one more. Okay. We're going to take this from the internet group.
Eileen says, please ask Dwight to share his observations on John Mitchell.
What?
John Mitchell.
John Mitchell. John Mitchell is a tremendous guy who got himself into a lot of trouble, and very tragically so. You cannot understand what happened with John Mitchell without understanding Martha Mitchell. I'll tell a very quick story. When the morning that Nixon won, we were in the Waldorf Astoria presidential suite. I had been the one that went into the bedroom and said, sir, you've just been elected president. I had that incredible privilege. He jumps out of bed. He's got a robe on. He comes in to see the TV set. Mitchell is following him, and Haldeman and Ehrlichman. They had all been kind of back in that back room waiting. And so Nixon looks at the TV, then he turns and he goes down the hallway to see Mrs. Nixon and his two daughters. And they have a little congratulatory session, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. He comes back in, so we're standing in the suite. And so he puts his arm around John Mitchell, who had been his campaign manager. And he said, John, we're going to go down this afternoon to Florida, and we're going to start putting the government together. And this was the first time I had ever heard these words. John Mitchell said, Mr. President-elect, he said, I'll have to meet you down there. I've got to go take care of Martha. And Martha was at Silver Hill. Some of you may know where Silver Hill is, over near Darien in that area. And she had been up there for the last part of the campaign. She was an incredibly disturbed woman. They call him an anxiety center. Now we know him more as a rehabilitation and abuse and addictions and so forth. But John didn't go with us to Florida, and he did go take care of Martha. That started a whole sequence of Nixon saying, I want you to be Attorney General, and Mitchell saying no. And Nixon kept putting the pressure on it, and Mitchell said no. And it got to a point where the words were something like Nixon saying, John, you've got to do what your president wants. And he caved. He knew they didn't belong in Washington. Martha got there. She was a problem from the outset. And several of the factors that get involved in Watergate is much too complex to try to get into here tonight. But Martha is the one that John had stayed up all night taking care of her one night. She was on a rampage, throwing things and so forth. And the next morning, after this nighttime thing, is when Jeb Magruder, who was running the committee to reelect the president, he was the deputy manager, claims that Mitchell approved several things to include the break-in. Mitchell has always denied that, denied it all the way through. But fate took over, and John Mitchell, I think John spent almost 20 months in prison. When he got out, I spent a great deal of time with him, many dinners, many lunches. I learned a lot from him, and I have the highest regard for him, knowing that he made some serious mistakes. The most serious mistake he made was the break-in happened on Saturday morning. The guys were incarcerated, and by 10 o'clock that Saturday morning in Washington, D.C., we knew, by we, not me, but they knew that the committee to reelect the president was involved. John Mitchell was on a campaign trip out in California. He was called and told this, and he came, the next day, he comes back to Washington and starts working on it. Instead of picking up the phone, calling Richard Nixon and saying, Mr. President, something happened. Our people were involved. I'll get to the bottom of it. And when I do, I'll let you know who has to go. We'll get this taken care of. That didn't happen. Had that happened, no Watergate. Yes.
Your grandson had a question.
John, this is John Pavelski, my one of my grandchildren. And by the way, let me say that right next to him, he arrived a little late, is my another grandson, Billy. And as any of you that have looked at the book know, Terry and I, between us, we have 15 grandchildren, and 2 of them are here tonight, and they are very special people. So, okay. John, do you have a question?
So, had Dean not lied to the president, or had Mitchell unraveled the case, or had Watergate not even been committed in the first place, and history had gone as it had, do you think there would not have been such a big distrust between the two parties as there is today?
Yes, that's a great question. Well, first of all, let me take the latter part of your answer. I think there'll always be distrust between the two parties. It's an adversarial thing, so we're going to have it. But I think that the intensity of the and the questions of honesty and integrity and so forth would have been much less if that had not happened. Had we not had Watergate, the Nixon administration was following something called the Aides Commission, which most people have not heard about, but it was a complete reorganization of the executive branch. In its own way, it was as significant as Nixon going to China or going to Russia. The reorganization of our federal government was the next item on Nixon's agenda. And it's unfortunate that didn't get done because the government does need to be restructured. With that, I think we're going to have to say thank you, everybody. And thank you for being here.
Books.